Jackson Reed stood at the altar, jaw clenched so tight he could hear his teeth grinding. In 10 minutes, he was supposed to marry a woman he'd met 3 times. A woman the whole town called the old maid. A woman who had no more choice in the matter than a calf at branding time. The banker's voice was a cold echo in his head. Marry within the month, or lose the ranch. It was a death sentence either way. He could feel the eyes of the town on his back, the whispers slithering through the pews. They thought they were saving him, saving his little girl, saving his land. They had no idea they'd just lit the fuse on a powder keg. Just 2 weeks ago, he was in Morrison's office practically begging. The drought had taken half his herd, and the debt was a noose tightening around his neck. Morrison had leaned back in his leather chair, a snake-like smile playing on his lips. "I've got a solution for you, Reed," he'd said. "The town committee feels you need a wife. For that little girl of yours. We've found the perfect candidate." Jackson had laughed, a raw, bitter sound. "I buried my wife 6 months ago, Morrison. I'm not in the market for a new one." But Morrison's smile never faltered. "Then you'll be burying your ranch too. Marry Lillian Hartwell by the end of the month, or I call in every last cent you owe." There was no choice. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order. The very next day, the town's chief busybody, Mrs. Henderson, had shown up at his door with the solution in tow. Lillian Hartwell, 28 years old, which in this part of the country made her a fossil. She was the school teacher, arrived from Boston 3 years back under a cloud of mystery. The kids were scared of her, and the men were intimidated by a mind they knew was sharper than their own. She was tall, severe, and wrong for him in every way a person could be. What Jackson didn't know was that Lillian was trapped in a cage of her own. Back in Boston, she'd been engaged to a society prince, only to find out he already had a wife. The scandal had shattered her life. Her father, a respected doctor, had died of a broken heart. She'd fled west to disappear, to teach children on the frontier and forget the whispers of damaged goods. But the whispers had followed her, and now she had her own ultimatum. The school board chairman, a man named Williams who was thick as a post and twice as dense, had cornered her just yesterday. "Miss Hartwell, the board feels it's improper. A woman of your age, alone. People are talking." Lillian had stood tall, her Boston spine ramrod straight. "My personal life is not the board's concern." Williams had just shaken his head. "In this town it is. Marry Jackson Reed and keep your job, or be on the next stagecoach out of town." So here they were, 2 prisoners walking toward a life sentence. The church doors creaked open. Lillian walked down the aisle in a plain gray dress, her face a mask of dignity hiding pure terror. She didn't look at the crowd. She looked only at the angry man waiting for her at the altar. The ceremony was a blur of tension. The Reverend spoke the words so fast they ran together. Jackson's 2-year-old daughter, Emma, cried the entire time from the front pew, a tiny mourner at her father's funeral. When the Reverend said, "You may kiss the bride," Jackson barely brushed his lips against her cheek. Lillian's face burned with a shame so hot it felt like a brand. The reception was even worse. The townspeople slapped Jackson on the back, congratulating themselves on their brilliant plan. "Everyone wins," Mrs. Henderson declared, loud enough for the whole room to hear. Jackson gripped his coffee cup, his knuckles turning white. He'd just traded his freedom for a ranch that was probably doomed anyway. The ride home was dead silent. Emma whimpered in Lillian's stiff, unfamiliar arms. When they reached the farmhouse, Lillian stepped out of the wagon and stared at the place. Clean, but empty of joy. A house that had given up. Jackson dropped their bags on the floor. "Let's get one thing straight," he said, his voice like ice. "This is a business deal. You have your room. You take care of Emma and the house. That's it. We don't pretend this is anything else." Lillian lifted her chin, that Boston pride a shield around her. "Fine by me, Mr. Reed. But I have my own terms. I require books and writing materials, and I will not be treated like a hired girl. I will raise your daughter my way." They glared at each other, two strangers bound by a contract they couldn't break. Emma started crying again, reaching for her father. Jackson scooped her up, a wave of relief washing over him. Lillian watched, a sharp pain cracking through her composure. Even a child could see she didn't belong. "I didn't ask for this," Jackson said, his voice low. Lillian picked up her bag. "Neither did I, Mr. Reed. But here we are." She walked up the stairs to her new prison, leaving him alone in the quiet darkness. They were two broken people, pushed together by a town that meant well. But good intentions can pave a road straight to hell. And neither of them knew that the foundation of their new home was built on a lie far more dangerous than an unwanted marriage. The first week was a silent war. They moved around each other like ghosts, two resentful shadows in a house too small for their anger. Lillian, with the efficiency of a military general, began reorganizing everything. She cleaned, she sorted, she imposed a Boston logic on his rustic chaos. Jackson, in a petty act of rebellion, would move things back as soon as she was done, trying to preserve the memory of his late wife, Sarah. He was clinging to a past that was already gone. Little Emma was caught in the crossfire. The tension in the house made her anxious and prone to tantrums. She refused to let Lillian feed her, threw toys whenever Lillian tried to play, and clung to Jackson like he was the last solid thing in her world. Lillian treated childcare like an academic subject, reading to the toddler from dry, educational books and trying to enforce a strict schedule. It was a disaster. "She doesn't like me," Lillian stated one evening, her voice flat as Jackson took a screaming Emma from her arms. "She's just adjusting," he mumbled. But they both knew it was a lie. Emma was a living, breathing reminder of everything they'd both lost. His happy marriage, her dream of a family. One night, everything changed. A storm blew in, a blizzard that howled like a demon and shook the little farmhouse to its foundations. Jackson had just come in from the barn when he heard Lillian scream his name. The sound cut through the wind, sharp with an urgency that froze his blood. He found them in Emma's room. His daughter's face was flushed a terrifying shade of red, her tiny body burning with a fever he could feel from across the room. Her breathing was a shallow, ragged gasp. "How long has she been like this?" Lillian demanded, her usual composure replaced by a fierce focus. "She was fine at dinner," Jackson stammered, his hands shaking as he touched Emma's forehead. It was like touching a hot stove. His mind flashed back to Sarah's death, how quickly a simple sickness had turned deadly, how helpless he'd been. "We have to get her to the doctor," he said, grabbing for his coat. Lillian's hand shot out and gripped his arm. "Look outside, Jackson. We'd never make it. The cold would kill her before we got a mile." He looked. The snow was a solid white wall. They were trapped, just like they'd been trapped in this marriage. But this time, it was his daughter's life on the line. "Then what do we do?" he whispered, the desperation clawing at his throat. Lillian was already moving. "My father was a doctor," she said, her voice steady and calm as she laid Emma on the bed. "I was his assistant for years. I know what to do, but I need your help." For the rest of that long, terrifying night, the walls between them crumbled. Lillian took command with an authority that stunned him. She sent him for cool water, for clean cloths. She mixed a remedy from a small medical kit she'd brought from Boston, something he never knew she had. "Keep talking to her," she ordered as she worked. "Let her hear your voice. They fight harder when they know you're there." Jackson talked. He told Emma about the horses, about the coming spring, about how much her daddy loved her. And through his own stream of desperate words, he heard Lillian's voice join his. She sang soft lullabies in a language he didn't recognize. She told stories of brave princesses fighting off fevers like they were dragons. She whispered prayers with a sincerity that shook him. For the first time, he saw past the stern schoolteacher. He saw a woman fighting for his child's life with everything she had. As the first gray light of dawn crept through the window, Emma's fever broke. Her breathing evened out, and she fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. Jackson slumped in his chair, utterly spent. Lillian sat by the bed, her hand resting gently on Emma's chest. "She's going to be fine," she said softly. And in her voice, Jackson heard not duty, but love. A fierce, protective love for his daughter. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling small and inadequate. She looked up, a flicker of surprise in her tired eyes. Then she gave him a small, genuine smile, the first he'd ever seen. It transformed her face, and he realized with a jolt that she was beautiful. "My father used to say that healing is about caring enough to fight for someone," she said, "even when the odds are impossible." Later that morning, with Emma playing quietly on the floor, they shared coffee. For the first time, they actually talked. She told him about the sister in Colorado she'd come west to help, only to find she was no longer needed. He told her about Sarah, about how he never thought he could love again. Then, surprising himself, he told her the truth about the ranch. "It's failing," he confessed. "Even without Morrison's threats, I don't know how I can hold on." Lillian set her cup down and looked him straight in the eye. "I'm good with numbers, Jackson. Better than most men. Let me see your books." His first instinct was prideful refusal. But then he remembered her in the sick room, calm and competent while he was falling apart. He led her to his desk and opened the ledgers. 3 hours later, she looked up, her face a mask of cold fury. "These numbers are a lie," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "Jackson, I think someone has been systematically stealing from you for years." The accusation hung in the air. A forced marriage was one thing. This was something else entirely. This was a conspiracy. And as he looked at his unwanted wife, he realized with a shock that he wasn't facing it alone. Lillian dove into the ranch's financial records like a hawk circling its prey. For 3 days, she barely ate or slept. The kitchen table was buried under a mountain of ledgers and receipts. What she uncovered was a web of deceit so intricate and cunning, Jackson never would have seen it on his own. It was more than just a few shady loans. Banker Morrison had been bleeding him dry for years. He'd fabricated charges for cattle feed that was never delivered. He'd inflated interest rates to illegal levels. He'd invented service fees out of thin air. The drought was real, but it was Morrison's theft that had pushed Jackson to the breaking point. It was all a setup. "Look," Lillian said, her finger tracing a column of figures. Jackson leaned over her shoulder, the scent of her hair clean and floral, a strange comfort in the middle of his rage. For a moment, they weren't strangers. They were partners, a team. "He created the crisis," Lillian explained, her voice tight with anger. "He pushed you to the edge of ruin so the town committee would have an excuse to step in. He wanted you weak. He wanted you desperate." Jackson straightened up, a cold dread washing over him. "Why? Why go to all that trouble?" Lillian's eyes were sharp, analytical. "That's the part that doesn't make sense. It's too elaborate for just skimming a few $100s. There's a bigger play here. He didn't just want your money, he wants your land." The realization hit Jackson like a physical blow. The marriage wasn't a solution, it was a weapon. They forced him to marry an outsider, a woman with no family or allies in town, assuming she'd be too intimidated or ignorant to question anything. They assumed wrong. "We need proof that will stand up," Lillian said. "I can lay out the financial case, but to take down a man like Morrison, we need more. We need to find out who else is involved." Jackson shook his head. "Morrison is the most powerful man in town. No one will dare speak against him." But Lillian gave him a smile that was all sharp edges. "People believe evidence, Jackson, and fear dies when people realize they aren't alone. I'll wager you aren't his only victim. They decided to start with the other ranchers who had loans with Morrison. It was a risky move. Snitching on the town banker could get a man blacklisted, or worse. Their first visit was to an old rancher named Silas Croft, a man whose land bordered Jackson's. Silas was weathered and wary, his eyes full of a deep-seated suspicion. Jackson explained their situation, but Silas just shook his head. Best leave it alone, son. Morrison owns this town. But then Lillian spoke. She didn't threaten or plead. She laid out the facts, calmly and logically, showing Silas a forged receipt from Jackson's ledger that was identical to one of his own. She showed him how the interest was calculated, a clear violation of territorial law. She spoke not as an accuser, but as an ally. She was offering him a way out. Silas stared at the papers, his tough facade cracking. He did the same to me, he whispered, his voice thick with a shame he'd carried for years. Told me I was a bad businessman, drove my son away, thinking his old man was a failure. That was the crack in the dam. After Silas agreed to talk, 2 more ranchers came forward. Men who had been slowly strangled by Morrison's predatory loans, all of them convinced they were alone in their failure. Lillian compiled their stories, building a fortress of evidence. The confrontation was set for Friday morning at the bank. Jackson and Lillian walked in together, not as a broken rancher and his mail-order bride, but as a unified force. Morrison greeted them with his usual oily charm. The happy couple. How's married life, Reed? We're here about the fraud, Lillian said, her voice cutting through the pleasantries like glass. She spread the documents on his desk, the ledgers, the forged receipts, the sworn statements from Silas Croft and the others. Morrison's face went from pale to purple. He blustered, he threatened, he called her a meddling city woman who didn't understand how things worked out here. But Lillian didn't flinch. I understand theft, Mr. Morrison, and I understand conspiracy. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. And I know you didn't do this alone. The same town committee that forced my husband to marry me. They've been helping you, haven't they? Covering your tracks. Who are they, Mr. Morrison? Is it Williams, the school board chairman? Is it Mrs. Henderson? Morrison's eyes widened in panic. She had him. The crowd that had gathered outside the bank, drawn by the commotion, pressed against the windows. His power was built on the perception of invincibility, and in that moment, it shattered. Fine, he croaked, his voice a dry rasp. I'll fix the accounts. You'll do more than that, Jackson said, his own voice hard as granite. You will provide full restitution to everyone you've cheated, and you will give us the names of your partners. They walked out of that bank into the sunlight, leaving the ruins of a petty tyrant behind them. That night, for the first time, the house felt like a home. Jackson opened a bottle of wine he'd been saving. To you, he toasted, looking at Lillian across the table. You should have been a lawyer. She laughed, a sound that was starting to become familiar. They don't let women be lawyers, but they do let them be wives. Their eyes met, and something electric passed between them. It wasn't just gratitude anymore. It was respect, admiration, and something else. Something deeper and more dangerous that neither of them was ready to name. The war for the ranch was won. But they had just made enemies of the most powerful people in town. And the real battle was just beginning. In the weeks that followed their victory over Morrison, a fragile truce settled over the farmhouse. The tension was gone, replaced by a tentative curiosity. They started talking, really talking, in the evenings after Emma was asleep. He told her about his dreams for the ranch, dreams he thought had died with Sarah. She told him about Boston, about the intellectual world she'd been forced to leave behind. They were 2 incredibly different people, from 2 different worlds, yet they found a surprising amount of common ground in their shared stubbornness and sharp minds. The physical space between them began to shrink too. They'd brush shoulders in the kitchen, Their hands would touch as they passed a cup of coffee. Each accidental contact was a small spark in the quiet house. Jackson found himself watching her, noticing the way a stray piece of hair would fall across her forehead when she was concentrating on the account books, or the unexpected warmth in her smile when Emma made her laugh. He was starting to see the woman, not the arrangement. Emma was the bridge between their two separate islands. The little girl, no longer caught in a web of anxiety, began to blossom. One afternoon, she ran to Lillian with a scraped knee, crying, "Mama Lily!" Without a second thought. Lillian froze, her eyes wide with shock, before she gently cleaned the cut and kissed it better. Jackson watched from the doorway, his heart twisting in his chest. A part of him felt a pang of guilt, a betrayal of Sarah's memory. But a larger part felt an overwhelming sense of rightness. This was a family. It wasn't the one he'd planned, but it was real. Their fragile peace was shattered by the arrival of a letter bearing a Boston postmark. It was addressed to Lillian. She read it with a face devoid of all emotion, then passed it to Jackson without a word. It was from a lawyer. Her former fiancé, the man who had ruined her, was now a widower. His wife had died, and he was formally and publicly apologizing for his youthful indiscretion. He was offering her a chance to return to Boston, to restore her name and take her rightful place in society. He was offering her the life she was supposed to have. The letter was a bomb dropped into the middle of their quiet life. It represented everything Lillian had lost, and everything she could now regain. A world of comfort, respectability, and intellectual peers. A world away from dust, drought, and a marriage of convenience to a rough-hewn rancher. "What are you going to do?" Jackson asked, his voice carefully neutral, though his stomach was churning with a feeling he refused to name. It felt a lot like fear. "I don't know," she said quietly, folding the letter. "He destroyed my family. My father died because of the shame he brought upon us." But there was a flicker of something in her eyes, a longing for the world she'd been ripped away from. The unspoken question hung between them for days. Was this life, their life, enough? Was he enough? The town dance was their first public outing since the bank incident. The remaining members of the town committee, their power diminished but their resentment simmering, watched them with cold eyes. But most of the town now saw them as heroes. They were no longer the mismatched couple. They were the Reeds, the couple who had stood up to the corruption that had plagued the town for years. Lillian wore a borrowed blue dress, and with her hair softened around her face, she looked breathtaking. Jackson couldn't take his eyes off her. When he asked her to dance, her hand in his felt like it belonged there. "We're good at this," she murmured, her face close to his. "At what?" he asked, his voice rough. "Pretending," she said, but the smile in her eyes told a different story. They weren't pretending anymore. The spell was broken when a man stumbled through the doors of the town hall, his face pale with panic. "It's the Weatherbys!" he shouted. "They're here! Sarah's parents!" Jackson's blood ran cold. The Weatherbys. They had despised him from the moment he married their daughter, believing a poor rancher was beneath their wealthy Boston family. They hadn't even come to Sarah's funeral. Why were they here now? He and Lillian rushed home, a sense of dread hanging over them. They found them waiting on their porch. Mr. and Mrs. Weatherby, dressed in funereal black, their faces set like stone. And standing beside them was a lawyer, holding a sheaf of papers. "We're here for our granddaughter," Mrs. Weatherby announced, her voice dripping with disdain as she looked from Jackson to Lillian. "A child should be with her proper family, not in this hovel with a stranger." The lawyer stepped forward and handed Jackson the papers. It was a custody petition. They were suing for Emma. Their claim? That Jackson was an unfit father, proven by his financial instability, and his hasty sham marriage to an adventuress of questionable character. They were going to take his daughter. And they were going to use the very arrangement that saved the ranch to destroy his family. The custody hearing was a nightmare. The Weatherby's lawyer, a slick talker from Boston, painted a picture of Jackson as a desperate, failing rancher who had entered into a loveless marriage purely for financial gain. He twisted the story of their fight against Morrison, portraying them not as heroes, but as reckless vigilantes who had made powerful enemies and put their child in danger. He brought up Lillian's past, the scandal with her married fiancé, painting her as a woman of loose morals, an unsuitable guardian for a young girl. The town, which had so recently celebrated them, was now divided. The remnants of Morrison's cronies on the town council sided with the Weatherbys, providing testimony that painted Jackson and Lillian in the worst possible light. It was a coordinated attack, a vicious act of revenge. Jackson and Lillian felt the ground crumbling beneath them. How could they prove their marriage was real? How could they prove their family was built on love when its foundation was a business deal? They were losing. Jackson could feel it. The judge, an old traditionalist, was clearly swayed by the Weatherbys' wealth and social standing. He looked at Lillian with suspicion, at Jackson with pity. Despair was beginning to set in. On the last day of the hearing, Lillian was called to the stand. She looked small and vulnerable, but when she spoke, her voice was clear and steady. She didn't talk about law or finances. She talked about Emma. "I did not give birth to Emma Reed," she began, her eyes locked on the judge. "But I have held her through fevers in the dead of night. I have taught her the names of the wildflowers that grow in our meadow. I have rocked her back to sleep after nightmares. Love, Your Honor, is not about biology. It's about showing up. It's about choosing to be a mother every single day." Her voice cracked with emotion. "The Weatherbys can offer her wealth. I can only offer her a home. I can only offer her my whole heart." It was powerful, but Jackson feared it wouldn't be enough. The lawyer for the Weatherbys stood up, a smug look on his face, ready for his cross-examination. "Mrs. Reed," he began, his voice dripping with condescension, "you claim to love this child. Yet isn't it true that you recently received a proposal to return to Boston, to a life of comfort and wealth with your former associate?" A gasp went through the courtroom. Jackson's heart stopped. Lillian paled. The lawyer had found out about the letter. "Did you, or did you not, consider abandoning this so-called family for a better offer?" the lawyer pressed. Lillian looked cornered, trapped. The whole case, Emma's entire future, balanced on her answer. She took a deep breath. "Yes," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound clarity. "I did receive such an offer." The lawyer smiled, sensing victory. "And what was your reply?" Lillian looked past the lawyer, past the judge, her eyes finding Jackson's in the stunned courtroom. "My reply," she said, her voice soaring with a strength that brought tears to Jackson's eyes, "was that my rightful place was no longer in Boston. My rightful place is on a dusty ranch in Wyoming. My rightful place is with my husband, and my rightful place is with my daughter, Emma." But the lawyer wasn't done. He pulled out one last, devastating weapon. "Your Honor," he said, turning to the judge, "we have one final piece of evidence, a letter written by the late Sarah Reed Weatherby shortly before her death." He handed a document to the court clerk. In it, she details her husband's financial incompetence and expresses her grave concerns for her daughter's future should she remain in his care. She explicitly states that in the event of her death, she wishes for custody of her daughter to be granted to her parents. It was a lie. It had to be a lie. Sarah would never do that. But as the clerk read the letter aloud, Jackson recognized his late wife's handwriting. The words were a knife in his heart, a betrayal from beyond the grave. The letter sealed it. He could see it in the judge's eyes. The Weatherbys had won. They were going to lose Emma. That night, the farmhouse was silent as a tomb. They had lost. The judge would make his ruling in the morning, but it was a formality. Emma was asleep upstairs, oblivious to the fact that her world was about to be torn apart. Jackson sat at the kitchen table, Sarah's letter on the table in front of him, his world shattered. He had not only lost his daughter, but the memory of his first wife was now tainted by this inexplicable betrayal. "It doesn't make sense," Lillian said, her voice a ragged whisper. She had been staring at a copy of the letter for an hour. The handwriting is hers, but the language? Financial incompetence. Fiduciary responsibility. It doesn't sound like a rancher's wife. It sounds like a banker. It sounds like Morrison. A tiny spark flickered in the darkness. Lillian stood up and began pacing, her mind working furiously. The custody battle. The Weatherbees showing up out of nowhere. It's all connected. Morrison's revenge. He couldn't ruin you financially, so he decided to ruin you personally. He conspired with the Weatherbees. He must have. "But the letter, Lillian," Jackson said, his voice hoarse. "It's her handwriting." "Is it?" Lillian said, her eyes gleaming with a sudden, fierce intensity. "Or is it a brilliant forgery? Morrison knew Sarah. He had access to her signature on bank documents. Jackson, think. When did Sarah write this supposed letter?" "The lawyer said it was dated a week before she died," Jackson replied. Lillian's eyes widened. "A week before she died," she repeated slowly. "Jackson, where did you keep your important papers back then? Your deeds, your loans?" "In the strongbox at the bank," he said. "At Morrison's bank." Lillian slammed her hand on the table. "That's it. It has to be. Sarah didn't write that letter. Morrison did. He forged it. He's been planning this for years. This was his endgame all along. If he couldn't steal the ranch, he would steal your child and hand the ranch's heir over to his allies, the Weatherbees. It was a wild theory, a desperate gamble, but it was the only thing they had." "How do we prove it?" Jackson asked, a sliver of hope piercing through his despair. "We need a confession," Lillian said. "And I know just how to get it." The next morning, just an hour before the final ruling, Lillian walked into Morrison's bank. Alone. She told Jackson to wait at the courthouse. This was something she had to do herself. Morrison was sitting at his desk, a smug, triumphant look on his face. "Come to beg, Mrs. Reed?" he sneered. "A little late for that." "I'm not here to beg," Lillian said, her voice cold and even. "I'm here to offer you a deal." She placed the letter from her Boston fiancé on his desk, the one offering her a new life. "The Weatherbees are going to win," she said. "Jackson will be broken. He'll sell the ranch for pennies on the dollar. You'll get what you always wanted, but I'm leaving. I'm going back to Boston, and I want my share." Morrison stared at her, stunned. "Your share of what?" "My share of the silence," Lillian said, leaning closer. "I know you forged that letter, Morrison. I know you and the Weatherbees planned this whole thing. I'm not going to expose you. Why would I? I'm done with this place. I just want enough money to start over. A small price to pay to ensure your secret stays buried." It was the perfect bait. She was playing to his greed and his arrogance. He believed she was just like him, selfish and opportunistic. He laughed, a low, ugly sound. "You're smarter than I gave you credit for, schoolteacher. That letter was a masterpiece, wasn't it? Took me weeks to perfect Sarah's handwriting. The Weatherbees paid handsomely for it." He leaned back, gloating. "They get the girl, I get a piece of the ranch when they force the sale. Everyone wins." "Not everyone," a voice said from the doorway. Morrison spun around. Jackson was standing there, and beside him, Sheriff Miller. They had heard every word. The look on Morrison's face, the sudden, complete understanding that he had been played, was a sight Jackson would cherish for the rest of his life. They raced to the courthouse, Sheriff Miller dragging a sputtering, defeated Morrison behind them. They burst into the courtroom just as the judge was about to deliver his verdict. "Your Honor, we have new evidence!" Jackson shouted. What followed was swift and decisive. Morrison, facing a long prison sentence for fraud, conspiracy, and forgery, confessed to everything. He detailed the entire plot with the Weatherbys, how they had planned to seize Emma and, through her, gain control of the ranch. The Weatherbys were arrested on the spot, their faces a mixture of shock and impotent rage. The judge, his face grim, tore up his original ruling. He declared the custody case null and void, dismissed with extreme prejudice. He awarded custody of Emma solely and permanently to Jackson and Lillian Reed. He looked at Lillian, a newfound respect in his eyes. "Mrs. Reed," he said, "this court and this town owes you an apology. Emma was theirs. She was safe." As they walked out of the courthouse, Lillian, Jackson, and a confused but happy Emma held tight between them. They were met with a crowd of cheering townspeople. They hadn't just saved their daughter. They had saved the entire town from the cancer of corruption that had been poisoning it for years. That night, for the first time, Jackson led Lillian not to her separate room, but to his. "This wasn't supposed to happen," Lillian whispered as he closed the door behind them. "None of it." "No," Jackson said, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer deny. He gently touched her cheek. "But it did. He had been forced to marry her to save his ranch, but in the end, she had saved him. She had saved his daughter. She had saved his soul. He had fallen in love with his wife. And as he leaned down to kiss her, not with the hesitant gratitude of before, but with all the passion and love in his heart, he knew their real story was just beginning." 1 year later, Jackson stood on his porch and watched Lillian teach a now 4-year-old Emma how to weave wildflowers into a crown. The ranch was thriving. The cattle were fat, the fields were green, and for the first time since he'd inherited the land, they were truly profitable. But the real transformation was in the home. It was filled with laughter. Lillian was pregnant, her belly round with their first child together. She had abandoned the severe gray dresses for soft blues and greens, and her face, once a mask of stern defensiveness, was now open and radiant with happiness. The town had changed, too. With Morrison and his cronies gone, a new sense of fairness and opportunity had taken root. And at the center of it all was Lillian. She had started a small schoolhouse on their property, teaching not just Emma, but a dozen children from the surrounding ranches. The old maid from Boston had become the respected heart of their community. Emma ran up to the porch, holding the lopsided flower crown. "It's for the new baby, Mama Lily," she said, her voice bright and confident. Lillian's face lit up with a love so pure it took Jackson's breath away. He thought back to that desperate man at the altar, full of anger and resentment. He had been so sure his life was over. He had been so wrong. His life was just beginning. That night, as they sat on the porch swing, Emma asleep in Lillian's lap, Lillian looked up at the stars. "Do you ever think about that day?" she asked softly. "Our wedding." Jackson smiled, pulling her closer. "I think about how the whole town thought they were forcing two broken people together to solve a problem. They thought they were saving a ranch." He looked at his happy daughter, at his beautiful pregnant wife, at the peaceful land stretching out before them under the moonlight. "They had no idea," he whispered, "that they were creating a miracle. They had been forged in the fire of hardship and betrayal, their love story written not in poetry, but in court documents and account ledgers. It wasn't the love story either of them had ever dreamed of. It was better. It was real." If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of unexpected love and frontier justice.